we're in a very interesting time right now, culturally and in the fashion industry, and for all of us personally who care about the natural world, in that it's like a crunch point. Look what's happening at the UN right now and how the conversation is moving, as it should do, very swiftly towards carbon footprints and what kind of industry we can even sustain in the future. I mean, it's all linked to the system that we live in. To me, I try to work inside the system. I work for a commercial fashion magazine, for a big brand. But I also believe that we can shape a more sustainable industry, and that designers and retailers and everyone who works in the modern fashion industry has a pathway to make it more sustainable. We need to be careful that we're not tinkering around the edges and doing a few little things that sound good and give us useful marketing opportunities to say that we're becoming greener and cleaner. I think we do need some deep change. This is an industry in which large numbers of us operating within it, whether they're models or stylists or buyers, travel all the time to different cities to spruik their wares or buy their wares or talk or turn up. I do it all the time. Are we going to be able to continue to do that? I'm not sure. The other conversation that this opens up is this whole thing about carbon offsetting, which I'm sure if you've been looking closely at the fashion news is now the big news from all the big brands. So you've got Gucci, you've got Burberry saying we're going to be carbon neutral, or this show or this whole company, in the case of Caring, is going to attempt to become carbon neutral. And that's complex. As I mentioned before, we're at this interesting, potentially frightening cultural moment where the climate crisis is happening now, and everybody knows it's not something we can talk about as a future possibility. We're living through it. And to answer your question, why are the big brands now stepping up engagement on some of these big, bold ideas about how they might redraw the way they calculate their environmental footprint? It's because consumers expect it, and not acting now, I think, is about to become untenable. And we talk a lot about how old-fashioned it is for anyone who is making anything, small or big, in the fashion industry to not have something to say about sustainability. And I think that that is a cultural moment, and it's only going to get louder. And if you're doing nothing, I mean, I would probably say that if you're doing nothing, which we may make that charge at some of the big high street brands, you're probably not going to survive.
Focusing on the cottons, we were saying that like things are more disposable. They have like less worth to the individual if they've only been bought for £10. People think less about the purchase they're making.
A kind of con of fast fashion is that often the supply chain isn't very transparent at all.
Right.
And, you know, that's because I think if they were honest about how they made a £2 top, they wouldn't want people to know.
The cost of fast fashion also gives us the wrong idea of the real cost of clothes. We have people thinking that a T-shirt for £30 is too expensive, when really it's just because we have bad habits of buying things for £2 when it's not the real cost of it.
I'm Aisling. I'm a founder of The New Wardrobe, which is a social network to be able to share clothes and accessories with people in your local area. We just realised that if we share clothes like we did with friends in university or family, that you would be able to change up your wardrobe using the wardrobes that we already have without having to constantly buy new things all of the time.
And we need to be honest about the people who've got an excess or access to excess clothing and people that don't.
I have to say, I did a meet and greet in the foyer just with Rafaela, and I have to admit, some really interesting people. Like, we've got students here, we've got entrepreneurs, and yeah, I think it's, credit to you, Tamara, for bringing all these amazing people together. I think that is, round of applause for Tamara. I think that deserves, she deserves it. So I'm going to be talking about. Well, it's always a depressing one. The reality check. A lot of people feel that the 2016 referendum was not entirely democratic. Reason being was 17 million people didn't vote. They didn't get a chance to vote. 16-year-olds didn't get a chance to vote. These are all sort of questions that people are now asking. Should we have a second referendum, which is becoming more and more likely? Should we allow 16-year-olds to be part of that referendum? And should we introduce mandatory voting, getting everyone to have their say? Another thing that's happening at the moment, which is, again, another, I suppose, an attack on our democracy, is the case that was put forward by Gina Miller and also Joanna Cherry, who is an SNP, an MP for the Scottish National Party. And they've put forward a case that basically said that Boris Johnson's announcement of proroguing Parliament was unlawful, was unconstitutional. And it went forward with the Supreme Court, which is the highest of all the courts. And they just announced today, this morning, that it is unlawful. I'm sure all of you are now aware of what happens with a no-deal Brexit. We could just crash out. And that will reduce us to trading on World Trade Organization terms. So it would very much put our country from being the 5th largest economy to being, well, I don't know. I remember reading statistics, something about how our economy would be reduced to the size of Zimbabwe in the space of 5 years. The backstop is the problem. That is the reason why Theresa May's deal was rejected 3 times in Parliament. And it's interesting, though, it wasn't really talked about much during the referendum in 2016. Not at all. I don't remember it ever being a big issue or even, discussed at length. A UN report in 2018 found women around the world earn a quarter less than men. So being part of the EU does help in terms of building those kind of democratic values. The last thing that I wanted to mention was Brexit's impact on women. And we did some work into this, and we found that it is, yes, a gendered issue. A no-deal Brexit, without a doubt, would lead to a downfall in GDP. That means, as a government would do if there's a downfall in GDP, is that you've got to make cuts. And where are they likely to make those cuts? Well, they're likely to make those cuts in those areas, those public services that women play a prominent role.
The historical nature of the emotional route, I guess, in the sense that, we have quite, at least in my opinion, a quite privileged position in the European Union at the minute, in the sense that we don't have the euro and we have a veto, but we brought up the fact we have those in the first place meant that we weren't properly accepting the EU as it was.
What we're underestimating is the level of digital propaganda, as in when social media targets particular groups in particular ways, you don't even know you're making those decisions.
I'm very proud of this conversation that we're having this evening because so much of this happens online. So many times we think that we're voting, we have something to say, we've clicked, we've retweeted, we've hearted and whatever. In reality, it doesn't matter. What really matters is who's going to turn up when it's raining to a demonstration, who's going to say I'm a sustainability advocate and actually check on their neighbours when it's raining or when it's snowing, who's going to actually make sure their children are following the values that they're raising them to follow. And that's why these women make me so proud. I've been working in the luxury industry for 25 years. I've never tried to compromise what I do. What I have wanted to do is follow sustainability as an ethic and as an air that I've breathed. So many times it's got me into trouble. I've specialized in the African and Arabian market, and 25 years ago I had conversations like, why don't we not have black designers in Knightsbridge? Can you not see outside who's shopping? When you're a woman of color and you talk about democracy and you get passionate, all of a sudden you're the angry black woman. And that doesn't happen, in white middle class environments. And this room is amazing. And I think it's a reflection of Tamara's efforts for her to make sure that there is inclusivity. But I don't see why we have to talk about democracy. I don't see why we have to talk about sustainability. They both mean doing the right thing, right? So why, when a brand says we are now sustainable, what were you before? I think a lot of people are jumping on this sustainability bandwagon, and I'm really sad to say this out loud, because it's on trend, because it's not new. When I was little, my mum used to sew my clothes. She patched things up. So that was sustainability. The fashion industry has boomed and blossomed because of the color and the culture of Africa and the Middle East and the heritage and the storytelling. And that is what the core of a business is. Like what you were talking to me about, how do you implement that in business? It's in the story you tell. Unless you have, they tell you that in branding, right? Like, what is your story? What is your identity, your typography? That's the same as what's your henna print? What's the parting on your hair? What's your tribal scar on your face? What was your grandmother's name? What did you eat for breakfast when you were little? This is fashion. This is art. This is architecture. This is all of the things that make us matter.